In the final years of the Second World War, entire divisions vanished, archives were burned, and supply lines dissolved into rumor. But among the chaos, certain files remained, fragments of testimony, encrypted dispatches, and mission orders stamped with seals no government has ever acknowledged. They tell of convoys that left no tracks, transmitters that spoke long after their operators were gone, and directives so classified that their existence was denied even to those who signed them. This is not the story of the war we were taught. This is the story buried in its silence. The forgotten operations that never officially happened. Chapter 1. The Vanished Convoy of Operation Solstice. On the morning of February 16, 1945, a German supply column designated Operation Solstice departed from the outskirts of Stettin under heavy overcast skies. According to the surviving field manifest from the 11th Army Quartermaster Corps, the convoy consisted of 12 Opel Blitz trucks, 2 SDKFZ, 251 half-tracks, and 1 fuel tender, escorted by elements of the SS Technical Division, attached to the Kummersdorf proving grounds. Their destination was listed as Kolberg, a routine logistical transfer on paper, but buried among the coded field orders was a single classified appendix, stamped Amtag Geheimhaltungsstufe A4, indicating priority cargo, direct from Berlin. None of those vehicles were ever seen. Again, British Signals Intelligence at Bletchley Park intercepted fragmented Enigma traffic the following night, referring to transport of utmost secrecy, Div Engel. In charge. The name Engel appears nowhere else in the Waffen-SS registry, suggesting a pseudonym. The radio message ended abruptly mid-transmission at 23:48 hours. 2 subsequent attempts to re-establish contact received only static. Within 72 hours, Soviet forces under Marshal Rokossovsky had overrun the sector, effectively erasing any chance of recovery. Allied command assumed the convoy had been destroyed in retreat, yet no burnt-out remains or personal effects were ever documented by advancing Soviet or Polish units. In 1952, declassified fragments from Soviet Archive File 240-Chi-45 referenced an abandoned motor column bearing insignia unfamiliar to Red Army units, discovered in the Pomeranian forest, approximately 20 kilometers south of Białogard. Investigators reported sealed crates lined with lead foil and containing cylindrical metal housings marked only with serial codes prefixed. KM, a chemical analysis report attached to the file, noted traces of uraninite residue, suggesting an early-stage nuclear material transfer. The official Soviet explanation listed the find as abandoned machinery, non-operational. But the entire report was reclassified the following year. No photographs survive. American reconnaissance. Flights over the area in March 1945 captured faint parallel tire imprints leading off the main road toward a disused railway spur near the village of Lasky Koszalinskie. The tracks terminated abruptly at a tree line bordering the so-called Rügenwalder forest belt, a region riddled with pre-war industrial tunnels. Post-war Polish excavation records confirm that several subterranean chambers were discovered beneath a collapsed depot in that vicinity. The tunnels extended far deeper than typical munition storage architecture, reinforced with concrete stamped Reichsamt für Wehrtechnik, the Reich Office for Military Technology, an entity responsible for experimental research projects. By 1964, British intelligence analysts reviewing OSS transfer files encountered a mention of solstice materials in correspondence between the US Atomic Energy Commission and the Department of Defense's Project 63, an initiative concerned with tracking lost Axis scientific assets. The notation Origin Kolberg Line appeared beside a reference to High Containment Transport Failure, Feb 1945. No further documentation could be located. And when a FOIA request was filed decades later, the response stated simply, records unavailable, destroyed 1972. Local testimony complicates the picture further. Residents of Koszalin province have long circulated stories of wartime convoys entering the woods under heavy escort, engines muffled, headlights painted over. In 1981, a retired railway worker named Piotr Wozniak told an investigative journalist that his father had been ordered at gunpoint to shunt a train car into a sealed tunnel near Bukowo Morsky. The car, according to his account, contained 3 large containers, humming like transformers. He said SS guards promised they would return in 2 days to retrieve them. They never did. In 1991, following the collapse of the Soviet Union, a cache of captured German intelligence reports was released to Polish authorities. Among them was a typed memorandum dated February 14, 1945, signed by Dr. Hans Kammler, the SS general responsible for numerous secret weapons projects. The note referred to a final movement of prototypes eastward under Directive SO 45 and an order that no record shall persist of the cargo contents. Kammler himself disappeared. In April 1945, under mysterious circumstances, presumed dead, though no body was ever recovered, geological surveys conducted by NATO engineers during the 1950s revealed unexplained radiation anomalies along a 10-kilometer stretch of the Pomeranian coastline, specifically near Lake Jamno. Readings were low but persistent, inconsistent with natural sources. When a follow-up investigation was proposed, the Polish military declined access, citing unexploded ordnance concerns. The anomalies were never mapped publicly, and the dataset remains classified under NATO Security Protocol 4BA 2006. Polish Environmental Agency report on soil contamination inadvertently reignited interest in the case. Bore samples collected near the old railway spur revealed isotopic traces matching early generation uranium oxide, material consistent with pre-critical testing rather than refined weapon-grade compounds. Independent researchers linked these findings to wartime projects codenamed Glock and Uranverein, though official historians maintain there is no verified connection. The last credible sighting associated with Operation Solstice came from a Luftwaffe aerial reconnaissance logbook recovered in 1946. The entry for February 17th reads, in translation, Convoy Solstice confirmed on Route 158 northbound heavy load, flanked by half tracks. Weather deteriorating. Final contact 1700 hours. The pilot who wrote it, Oberleutnant Karl Zeiss, was later interrogated by Allied forces and reportedly described seeing strange metallic canisters, emitting a blue hue when exposed to dusk, light. His testimony was dismissed as a stress-induced hallucination. Over the years, numerous expeditions have attempted to locate the missing vehicles. None succeeded. The region remains dense with wartime debris and unexploded munitions, rendering excavation hazardous. Yet the folklore endures that somewhere beneath the pine roots of northern Poland lies a sealed chamber containing the remnants of technology the Third Reich never had the chance to deploy. Something buried not by the Allies, but by the Germans themselves. In a 2010 BBC documentary on lost Nazi projects, a former US Army technical officer, identified only as Harrison, stated off record that fragments of Solstice material had been recovered by Western intelligence in 1947 and shipped to Oak Ridge, Tennessee, under diplomatic cover. He claimed the artifacts were destroyed shortly thereafter under supervision of the Atomic Energy Commission, citing structural instability. When pressed for evidence, Harrison declined further comment, saying only, "We weren't supposed to find it, and when we did, we wished we hadn't." To this day, no official record acknowledges Operation Solstice beyond a single line in the Wehrmacht's 1945 Logistics Index, where it is labeled simply as aborted. Yet every related file, every field order, every personnel roster connected to that designation has either been lost, burned, or sealed under international classification. Historians call it coincidence. Intelligence veterans call it procedure. But those who have studied the surviving fragments believe something far larger vanished with that convoy, something too dangerous to let history remember. Chapter 2. Project Mirror, the double-agent ghost file. In late 1946, the smoke of war had cleared over Europe, but beneath the reconstruction effort, a second, quieter struggle had already begun. British and American intelligence agencies, once united against a common enemy, now turned their gaze eastward, toward their former ally, the Soviet Union. In this shifting landscape of espionage and betrayal, Project Mirror emerged. Its existence was never publicly acknowledged, and for decades, even within MI6, it remained an obscure rumor whispered in briefing rooms. A ghost operation built on deception, silence, and the reanimation of men who should have vanished with the Reich. Project Mirror began as an initiative of the British Control Commission for Germany, BCCG. In 1946, operating from the ruins of occupied Vienna, The official purpose was to track escaped Nazi intelligence officers suspected of being recruited by Soviet NKVD networks. But beneath that cover, an internal directive, labeled JIC Memo 243-46X, described a covert plan to weaponize deception by feeding controlled misinformation through false defectors. The field assets were to be Ex-Abwehr and Sicherheitsdienst, SD officers fluent in Russian and English, men whose loyalty could be bought through immunity, forged identities, or the promise of safe passage. The operation's logistics were coordinated through Section X, a deniable MI6 subsection led by Colonel Adrian Latham, a veteran of wartime intelligence who had served under SOE command in Cairo. His task was to rebuild an invisible network within the Soviet zone, using Vienna as the fulcrum point, a crossroads where Western agents, refugees and black market smugglers converged. It was from here that the first mirror agents were deployed under assumed identities, tasked not only to infiltrate Soviet channels, but to reflect back the flow of information, shaping Moscow's perception of Allied strength, troop placement, and technological development. By mid-1947, Mirror had 12 active agents operating in Eastern Europe under new names, each embedded in false commercial or diplomatic posts. Among them was MHD Agent Reinhardt, formerly SS Hauptsturmführer Karl Mertens, who had been sentenced to death in absentia by a Nuremberg tribunal for his role in Baltic operations. Under Mirror, he became Erik Hansen, a Danish trade representative stationed in Bratislava. Another was Victor Weiss, a supposed Swiss journalist with ties to post-war relief organizations, but in truth, a former Gestapo linguist with access to Soviet embassy circles in Budapest. Their reports, coded in a cipher designated Sigma, reached Section X via dead drops along the Danube, and encrypted radio burst through the Vienna Channel, an Allied communication route disguised as a humanitarian aid network. Everything changed in 1949, when the cipher stream labeled Sigma 9 arrived and abruptly stopped. The last confirmed message, decrypted by Bletchley's successor unit at GCHQ, contained only a series of map coordinates corresponding to a defunct Nazi safehouse network, once maintained by the Reichssicherheitshauptamt, RSHA, along with a short phrase, retrieval successful, request exfil. Mirror to close. Hours later, both Agent Reinhardt and Weiss disappeared. Their contact stations were found abandoned, radio equipment smashed, and their local handlers were reassigned or dismissed. No recovery teams were dispatched. Within weeks, all files labeled Sigma were sealed under a higher clearance code, Directive 46 Delta, a classification level typically reserved for nuclear matters. When MI6 was formally reorganized in 1952, Project Mirror was erased from the administrative index. Latham resigned the following year, citing health reasons, and retired to Sussex, where he lived in near isolation until his death in 1971. His private notebooks, confiscated by the Home Office, contained repeated entries referencing the Vienna Loop and lost film reels, suggesting that Mirror's true purpose went beyond deception. According to the few surviving excerpts, the operation's agents were not merely double-crossing the Soviets. They were hunting for microfilms stolen from German archives in 1945, allegedly containing photographic evidence of Allied war crimes committed during the final months of the war. Unverified accounts indicate that these microfilms, codenamed Archive Grey, had been captured by Soviet forces near Dresden and later vanished en route to Moscow. Mirror's directive, then, may have been to recover the material before it could be weaponized by the Soviets, a motive buried beneath layers of plausible deniability. The Sigma 9 message, if genuine, could have confirmed that retrieval, but with its senders gone, the evidence vanished into the same fog that concealed their existence. Decades later, fragments of Mirror's paper trail surfaced unexpectedly. In 1978, a minor break-in occurred at the Public Record Office in Kew. The perpetrators bypassed dozens of open files, but targeted one sealed box labeled Foreign Office, 1949-50, Vienna section. The thieves left behind no fingerprints, took nothing of apparent value, except for one item, a roll of undeveloped film. The following morning, the officer's night watchman was found unconscious, his service revolver missing. He could recall only that he heard a shutter click. Like a camera, the stolen film was never recovered, and the incident was buried under the ambiguous category of civil intrusion. In 1992, after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, a cache of NKVD documents was released to Western historians. Among the pages of Yar file number 7 Kausaiki, a Soviet counterintelligence briefing from 1950 referenced an Anglo operation using German defectors, codename Zerkalo, Russian for mirror. The report described a sting attempt against Soviet informants in Vienna and warned that enemy agents sought documents regarding the liberation conduct of Allied armies. The notation, subject neutralized, records destroyed follows, written in a different hand and darker ink, as if added later. The identity of the subject remains unknown. In 2003, an FOIA request unearthed one final trace, a transcribed conversation between CIA liaison officers and former British agents discussing Project Mirror's residual effects. A line in the transcript reads, "The Vienna film was recovered in 1951. One print remains, locked under Pentagon control." No record of that film has ever surfaced in public archives. To this day, Project Mirror exists only in hints, code numbers, erased pages, and ghost names that appear once in classified indexes before disappearing entirely. It represents the kind of operation that intelligence services never fully admit, one born of post-war moral greyness, where men guilty of atrocity were repurposed as tools against new enemies. Whether the missing agents succeeded in their mission or were silenced to protect both sides from scandal remains unknowable. But those who have studied the few surviving fragments agree on one thing. In the early years of the Cold War, the first casualties were not soldiers or spies. They were the truth itself, mirrored, reflected, and erased until nothing remained but rumor. Chapter 3: The Arctic Listening Station That Never Existed. In the winter of 1953, a joint US-Canadian mission known as Operation Icefall established a covert listening post somewhere in the Franz Josef Archipelago, a remote, frozen expanse north of Novaya Zemlya, deep inside the Arctic Circle. The base did not appear on any official maps. Its coordinates, later reconstructed from fragmented naval logs, placed it near Alexandra Land, roughly 80 kilometers from the Soviet frontier. According to documents later obtained under the US Freedom of Information Act, its objective was long-range interception of Soviet missile telemetry across polar trajectories. In plain terms, Icefall was designed to eavesdrop on the birth of the nuclear age. Construction began in November 1952 under the cover of a meteorological survey. The facility consisted of modular Quonset huts, a 30-meter radio tower, and a narrow airstrip carved into permafrost by US Army engineers from the FE, 6th Signal Battalion. Supply runs arrived monthly via ski-equipped C-47 transports out of Thule Air Base, Greenland. The personnel roster listed 12 men, 8 Americans, 3 Canadians, and 1 civilian consultant identified as Dr. Harold Finch, contractor, Radio Physics Division. Finch's employment records were later found to be falsified. No university ever confirmed his credentials. On February 2, 1953, Operation Icefall transmitted its first successful signal intercept, a shortwave burst believed to originate from Soviet rocket tests in the Plesetsk region. 2 days later, NORAD's early warning station at Goose Bay logged anomalous frequencies coming from the same polar sector. Analysts called it a ghost reflection, an echo that repeated the same pattern every 6 hours. The Icefall crew, under Station Commander Captain Richard Keene, began continuous monitoring. According to the surviving pages of Keene's logbook, the team noted that the signal repeats with mechanical precision, but contains harmonic interference inconsistent with known telemetry protocols. The last full entry ends with the words, "Pattern repeating. Source seems to be above, not east." On March 14th, the camp went dark. The last confirmed communication received from Icefall was a standard weather update at 04:17 GMT. When a scheduled supply flight attempted contact 3 hours later, no response came. Over the next 10 days, repeated hails on all frequencies produced only white noise, a low, rhythmic pulse that operators described as heartbeat-like. On March 24th, with the Arctic thaw approaching, a rescue mission designated Operation Turn was launched from Thule. It never found survivors. The official after-action report, declassified in 1989, paints a picture of eerie abandonment. The rescue team discovered the station intact, power generators running, coffee still warm in tin mugs. All 12 beds were unmade, clothing laid out as if the men had simply stepped outside. Personal effects, notebooks, wristwatches, and ration cards were neatly arranged on the mess table. The radios continued to emit low static, tuned to an unused frequency. No footprints led away from the camp. A single entry on the message board read, "Do not go outside until signal stops." The message was written in pencil, in a hand identified as Captain Keen's. The bodies were never recovered. When the Arctic Sun returned in May, aerial reconnaissance showed the installation buried under fresh ice and snowdrifts. By the following year, the site had been officially decommissioned. Yet internal NORAD memos from 1956 reference a secondary retrieval expedition conducted by US Navy submarine USS Atka, operating under Arctic Patrol Command. The submarine's logbook for June 12th of that year contains a single classified notation. Retrieved equipment per order. Icefall Alpha location compromised. Advise immediate containment. The word containment in naval parlance typically refers to radiological hazard. No subsequent report followed. Rumors soon circulated among intelligence personnel that Icefall's transmissions had never ceased. Between 1954 and 1960, civilian radio operators in Norway and Iceland intermittently picked up identical pulse patterns at 6-hour intervals, always from the same bearing, always with the same modulation drift. A 1959 analysis by the Defense Research Board of Canada concluded that the pulse sequence contained repeating numerical groups corresponding to a timestamp, but offset by 12 minutes from Greenwich Mean Time, a discrepancy suggesting that the source signal was being refracted or relayed. One engineer remarked in his report, "Either the transmission is bouncing from a point above the ionosphere, or someone is replaying Icefall's original recordings." In 1961, a classified US Air Force memorandum, Ref No. FSC 2041A, ordered the removal of all surviving Icefall documentation from NORAD archives and their transfer to BEAM Project Cold Light. A newly formed signals intelligence unit headquartered in Arlington. The memo's justification was terse. Potential compromise of strategic communications. Maintain permanent denial of operation existence. All personnel associated with Icefall were reassigned or retired. Captain Keen's family received an official telegram listing his cause of death as aircraft accident, Arctic region, though no such crash was recorded. Then, in 1972, a Soviet research icebreaker, the Komsomolet Severa, reported discovering remnants of an unidentified metal structure embedded in the ice near Alexandra Land. The ship's log, later leaked by defectors, described twisted antennae, rusted generator housings, and a partially intact US-manufactured shortwave receiver. Among the debris, they found a waterproof case containing magnetic tapes labeled Signal Record A3, A9, each marked with the year 1953. The tapes were confiscated by Soviet naval intelligence and disappeared into Leningrad's archives. When questioned decades later, Russian officials denied any record of their existence. In 1988, during preparations for a joint Arctic mapping initiative, a NORAD analyst named James Holbrook claimed to have located the original Icefall coordinates through declassified satellite imagery. He submitted a private memorandum to his superior stating that he had cross-referenced magnetic anomaly data with historical radar records. His memo concluded, "Icefall site likely still active. Recommend immediate field verification." 1 month later, Holbrook was found dead in his Washington apartment. The cause ruled a carbon monoxide leak. His report was never filed. Today, the Arctic Listening Station exists only as a rumor whispered among intelligence historians. A forgotten node in the early Cold War's network of secrets. No nation acknowledges having built it. No government claims its personnel. And yet radio enthusiasts occasionally report faint, rhythmic pulses on the 10.8. MH's band, identical to those first detected in 1953. They call it the Icefall beat. NORAD continues to list the coordinates of Alexandra Land as restricted airspace, designated Zone 5 Alpha. The official reason remains aviation safety, but among those who know the file by name, There is another explanation, that the frozen station still transmits, its equipment running on a generator buried under half a century of snow, sending a message no one understands to a sky that never answers. Chapter 4: The Hidden Directorate of Operation Paperclip. By 1945, the Third Reich was ash and rumour. Cities lay broken, generals were fugitives, and archives burned across a continent choking on surrender. Yet in the ruins of occupied Germany, a new campaign began. One fought not with tanks or divisions, but with files and silence. Operation Paperclip. Officially sanctioned by the US Joint Intelligence Objectives Agency, WWII, sought to extract Nazi scientists and engineers before the Soviets could claim them. Its public record speaks of progress and innovation, of rocket pioneers like Werner von Braun, of medicine, of technology that propelled the West into the space age. But in the classified layers beneath, there existed another branch, invisible even to most within the program itself. It was called Directorate 14. Directorate 14 was born from a crisis of control. By late 1946, dozens of German scientists were already under US custody, their knowledge deemed essential for national security. Yet not all were cooperative. Some refused debriefing, others demanded conditions, and a few knew things the Americans preferred never to surface. The solution, according to internal WWII correspondence dated December 3, 1946, was containment through controlled neutralization. Thus, Directorate 14 emerged, a covert enforcement arm responsible for what official memoranda termed irregular asset management. Its personnel were drawn from the Counterintelligence, Corp, CIC, and the OSS's defunct X2, Counter-Espionage Division, men accustomed to making evidence disappear. The unit's field base was established in Munich under the cover of the E-Technical Research Liaison Office. From there, teams tracked former SS and Wehrmacht scientists across the American and British zones. Targets were divided into categories: R for recruitment, T for transfer, and F for final. List F was compiled manually and updated weekly by a man known only through his signature, ML, der Dungeon 14. Historians believe those initials referred to Major Lawrence M. Laird, an Army intelligence officer later reassigned to Latin America. Laird's personnel file remains classified. Between 1946 and 1950, Directorate 14 orchestrated a series of disappearances across Bavaria, Austria, and Argentina. One of its earliest documented actions was Case File 423B. Subject: Dr. Erich Volken, a propulsion expert formerly attached to Peenemünde. Declassified CIC logs confirm that Volken was relocated to a safe house near Augsburg for preliminary evaluation. 2 weeks later, his name was struck from the paperclip roster, marked non-transferable. No further record exists. Yet in 1952, Argentine immigration records list an Erich Falkenstein, born 1905, arriving aboard the Monte Olivia from Genoa. The photograph attached to his passport, grainy, blurred but unmistakable, matches Volken. Volken was not alone. In 1948, a train derailed near Innsbruck, killing 4 passengers. Among the wreckage, investigators found a scorched briefcase containing identity papers for Dr. Gisela Brandt, a microbiologist once linked to SS medical experiments at Ravensbrück. Brandt's inclusion on paperclip lists had been contested by both US Army Medical Corps and British occupation authorities. Her file vanished weeks later. The death report from Innsbruck identified the victim as an Austrian textile merchant, but her dental records were never verified. A British liaison memo dated March 1949 notes tersely, Brandt confirmed relocated per D14 protocol. No further inquiry. Directorate 14's reach extended beyond Europe. After the war, hundreds of ex-Nazi scientists fled via so-called rat lines, covert escape routes through Spain and Italy managed by sympathetic clergy and intelligence intermediaries. When the US learned that the Soviets had begun recruiting these fugitives, D14 operatives were dispatched to intercept or eliminate potential transfers. In May 1950, an Italian police report from Genoa documented a warehouse explosion near the docks. Witnesses claimed to see American men in plain clothes removing crates and papers before local authorities arrived. The cargo manifest, retrieved decades later, listed chemical research samples from Kruppwerke Essen, materials believed lost in 1945. An internal State Department cable from 1951 refers to D-14 cleanup teams operating under diplomatic escort. These escorts were not military. They were consular staff attached to embassies in Buenos Aires, Montevideo, and São Paulo. Their mission? Track down scientists who had reneged on paperclip contracts or begun cooperating with Soviet advisors in South America. One such target was Professor Dieter Manke, a physicist formerly with the A9-A10 rocket program. Argentine police reports from June 1951 record his sudden death from heart failure at a cafe in Rosario. His autopsy, performed by a local physician, found traces of an unidentifiable neurotoxin in his bloodstream. 3 days later, an unmarked C-47 aircraft landed at Ezeiza Airport under diplomatic clearance. It departed before dawn. The destination field reads only classified. When the CIA absorbed JIOA oversight in 1947, Directorate 14 was folded into the agency's early untechnical services staff, the same division later responsible for MK Ultra. Yet no documentation confirms an official handover. In 1963, a cargo plane, tail number 4829, crashed in the Andes en route from Panama to Chile. Its manifest identified the flight as scientific equipment transport. Argentine radio logs noted that within 48 hours, the wreckage was cordoned off by US military personnel citing diplomatic immunity. Local climbers who reached the site before its recovery described sealed aluminum cases labeled JIOA-14 and stamped, "Do not declassify until 2099. Photographs taken by the climbers were confiscated. Their negatives later went missing from the Santiago Press Bureau. In 1975, a Senate subcommittee investigating CIA activities abroad uncovered a partial memo chain referencing Directive 14A. When questioned, former CIA Deputy Director Richard Helms dismissed it as a routine internal security directive. But among the declassified attachments was a handwritten annotation reading, "Legacy assets accounted for, most contained." The term contained in the lexicon of Cold War intelligence seldom meant safe. It meant neutralized. Survivors of paperclip, those few scientists who lived long enough to speak freely, mentioned whispers of a shadow group overseeing their transfers. Dr. Kurt DeBoo, later director at NASA's Kennedy Space Center, once told an interviewer off record, "There were men who came to Peenemünde after the surrender. Americans, yes, but not Army. They didn't wear insignia. They just took names off the lists." When pressed to elaborate, he declined, saying only, "They were not rescuing us. They were selecting who would be allowed to remember." No official document confirms Directorate 14's existence. Its alleged commander, Major Laird, disappeared from US personnel records after 1955. His last known posting was attached to the American embassy in Montevideo under a false civilian title. He was declared dead in 1961, though no death certificate has ever surfaced. A classified CIA personnel audit from 1978 lists one untraceable legacy officer, D-14 clearance, inactive. The page is redacted, except for a single sentence at the bottom. File sealed by order of National Security Council, indefinite. The myth of Directorate 14 persists among intelligence historians because it fits a pattern too precise to dismiss. A shadow bureaucracy designed to cleanse the record of inconvenient knowledge, to manage those who knew too much. It ensured that Operation Paperclip would remain a tale of progress, not prosecution. In that sense, the Directorate accomplished its mission perfectly. Every trace of its victims, every contradiction in its story was methodically erased. Only a few fragments endure: coded directives, lost air manifests, photographs that never made it to print. If those who once served under Directorate 14 left any confession, it lies buried not in archives, but in the silence of men who understood the weight of secrets carried from one war into another. In the end, Paperclip's legacy was not just rockets and science. It was the perfection of disappearance, the art of making history forget the people it could not afford to remember. Chapter 5, The Last Transmission of U-977. At dawn on May 10, 1945, 4 days after Germany's unconditional surrender, the submarine U-977 slipped out of Kristiansand, Norway, and vanished into the North Sea. Its commander, Oberleutnant zur See Heinz Schäfer, later claimed, that he intended to surrender in Argentina rather than to Allied forces in Europe, fearing Soviet captivity. Official history records that the voyage lasted 66 days, that the U-boat arrived at Mar del Plata in August, and that its surrender was routine. But the record hides what really happened between departure and arrival. An 18-day gap that has never been satisfactorily explained. In those lost days, U-977 transmitted a single radio message that no government would later acknowledge. Declassified fragments from Pius Bletchley Park's Omega file, released in 1997, reveal that on June 10, 1945, a Chilean coastal station intercepted an encrypted transmission on 11,780 kHz. The source signature matched U-977's Enigma call sign. The message consisted of a brief phrase and coordinates deep in the South Atlantic, approximately 5,200 kilometers north of Bouvet Island. When decrypted weeks later, the text read simply, "Cargo delivered, mission complete." There was no record of any cargo aboard U-977's manifest, which listed only food, fuel, and crew of 46. British naval intelligence classified the intercept as spurious and buried it. The signal log remained sealed for half a century. Scheffer's post-war memoir describes an arduous journey, crew fatigue, mechanical failures, scurvy, and fear of capture. But the timeline in his own narrative falters. A missing logbook section from May 22nd to June 9th. The US Naval Technical Mission interrogated Scheffer in September 1945. When asked about the missing entries, he replied, "Those days were without significance." The interviewer noted that Scheffer seemed evasive whenever questioned about a rendezvous south of Ascension Island. Another crewman, Oberbootsmat Hans Dana, later told Argentine reporters that the boat did not always travel submerged. There was a meeting with another vessel, perhaps a supply ship. No, such meeting appears in Allied naval records. Documents recovered from the Argentine Naval Archive in 2005 shed new light on what might have occurred. Among the surrender papers of U-977 is an unsigned English-language appendix titled Procedure for Decontamination of Compartment 4. The note references sealed containers, metallic, not to be opened before authorized delivery, and warns of chemical risk upon exposure. Argentine historians initially dismissed it as Allied fabrication. Yet a 1945 memorandum from the U.S. Office of Naval Intelligence, ONI, confirms that an American medical team boarded the submarine within hours of surrender and spent 12 hours below deck, conducting hazardous material inspection. Their findings were never released. Further complicating the story is the existence of WWII, another submarine that reached Mar del Plata 2 months earlier. Its crew also surrendered, claiming to have fled after Germany's defeat. Both boats originated from northern bases and arrived in Argentina under suspiciously similar circumstances. Late, unaccounted for, and in remarkably clean condition. Argentine naval officers who inspected U-530 noted absence of barnacles or salt corrosion, suggesting recent dry docking. If the boats had truly crossed the Atlantic submerged, their exteriors should have shown wear. Some investigators speculated that both subs may have rendezvoused with supply ships or secret installations en route. Between 1946 and 1950, Allied intelligence agencies quietly reopened the U-977 file under the codename Operation Latchkey. British SIS reports describe rumours of a southern cargo drop involving classified materials evacuated from Kiel before the German surrender. One lead pointed to Dr. Kurt Debussy, then under US custody, who allegedly told interrogators that several special freight containers had been loaded onto a U-boat bound for Zone Blau, a term used in internal SS documentation to designate a fallback region for strategic technology outside Europe. No further interrogation records survive. In 1950, divers operating under the US Naval Technical Mission South Atlantic Section reported sonar contact with an unidentified wreck at the same coordinates transmitted in the Omega intercept. The wreck measured 76 meters, identical to a Type 7IC U-boat. A subsequent dive confirmed hull features consistent with U-977's class, but noted implosion damage inconsistent with depth collapse. When the divers attempted to recover artifacts, they were recalled within 24 hours by orders marked Priority 1. The wreck site was then reclassified as restricted maritime territory under joint US-Argentine jurisdiction. No official explanation was provided. What little evidence remains of U-977's secret cargo points towards something far more consequential than contraband. An unmarked dossier in the CIA's 1963 South Atlantic Registry, partially declassified in 2011, contains references to materials of unknown metallurgy consistent with German wartime experimental research, recovered from a marine site under joint cover. One photograph, grainy, monochrome, shows men in naval uniforms lifting a cylindrical object from seawater. The object bears the faint outline of an eagle and swastika insignia, partially scorched away. The file ends with a summary line: disposition, destroyed under containment directive. Witnesses signed NDA. In the years that followed, fragments of testimony continued to surface. A former Argentine naval engineer, Carlos Pinheiro, claimed in a 1983 interview that he had inspected the submarine's batteries after surrender. He said one compartment had been welded shut, the air stale, the metal blackened as if scorched from within. He recalled an American officer ordering him to forget what he had seen. 2 months later, Pinheiro's house in Buenos Aires was ransacked, and his personal papers disappeared. He left Argentina soon after and was never heard from again. More recently, maritime historians examining oceanographic data near the Bouvet region discovered unusual magnetic anomalies consistent with ferrous debris fields, possibly submarine wreckage, stretching several kilometers along the seabed. The Norwegian Polar Institute confirmed that no recorded shipwrecks existed there prior to 1945. When researchers requested permission for a survey in 2012, the area was suddenly designated a marine preservation zone by the International Seabed Authority, blocking further investigation. As for Schäfer, he lived quietly after the war, publishing his memoir and emigrating to Argentina, where he died in 1979. Yet letters found in his estate suggest lifelong unease. In one, dated 1965, he wrote to a former crewmate, "They think we carried gold or men. They do not know what it really was. It was not ours to understand." The letter was unsigned and never mailed. The final mystery lies in an obscure entry from the Argentine naval log, Sector South, dated August 21, 1945, 2 days after U-977's surrender. It records an unidentified transmission received on the same frequency used by the submarine's Enigma key. The message contained only coordinates, matching those from the Omega file, followed by a single word: repeat. The origin was triangulated as somewhere within the South Atlantic, but no vessels were known to be operating there. The transmission was logged, archived, and forgotten. Today, U-977 rests in history as a curiosity, a footnote in the twilight of the Third Reich. But among naval archivists and intelligence historians, its voyage endures as an unsolved equation, a gap where logic falters, where recorded fact meets deliberate silence. Whether the submarine carried documents, technology, or something more dangerous, no one can say. Only one certainty remains: somewhere, in a locked archive or a sunken grave of steel and salt, the truth still sleeps beneath the coordinates that no nation dares to revisit. And perhaps, as some whisper, the sea itself keeps the last transmission repeating, unheard, unanswered, eternal. For decades, the official record has sealed these fragments behind redactions and missing pages. But the silence only deepens. Files labeled destroyed keep reappearing in archives that should not exist. Names once dismissed as rumor now match signatures on authentic orders. Convoys that vanished, agents erased, outposts abandoned. Yet the coordinates, the code names, the residual traces all align too precisely to be coincidence. If this is truly the forgotten history of the war, then what else still lies hidden beneath its ruins? Somewhere, beyond the reach of any Freedom of Information Act, the next file waits to be opened.